Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Stedman podcast. I hope you all had a wonderful Holy Week celebration. I, for one, I know there's always those memes out there where it's like pastor during Easter week, the pastor the day after Easter, and it's true. It's like, I was glad that I was going to take Monday off anyway, regardless, but then the lead pastor decided to just say everybody's off on Monday. So it's like, okay, cool. So that's it for us. So yeah, it's been nice. It's been a good day off. But someone who kind of doesn't have a day off is my co-host Micah. Micah, how are you doing today?
Um, Living the dream.
Living the dream.
Did
Working
you
from home, living the dream.
well, there is that. It is nice to be able to like run to a restaurant and not have to worry about parking on campus. 'Cause parking's always a nightmare. But
Yeah.
anyway, what I was going to say is that you survived. Obviously you're here, but you survived Holy Week, and I'm assuming everything went okay.
Yeah, everything went fine. The last Palm Sunday and this Sunday for our contemporary service, our live stream, like the audio wasn't working. But yet it'll work for the traditional service. So I'm not really sure. But I mean, we had packed houses at both, so everything was full. Especially in our traditional space in our sanctuary, we have a balcony, which we never have enough people for everyone to sit in a balcony, but we had people sitting in the balcony during Easter. So yeah, it was pretty good. And then it was nice because I got to lead pretty much a good portion of our traditional Monday, Thursday service, our Good Friday service, and even our traditional service. Got to lead a good chunk of that because of just let the pastor do what the pastor's doing. They don't have to run the whole show. So I got to kind of take some of those responsibilities. So that was good. Oh, excuse me. I don't know what I'm getting
He
choked up
survived
for.
Holy Week, but now that he's on the Scott Stedman podcast, it's not.
Well, I also went to the doctor today. So and right now, so far, everything's good. They have to just check my blood work. And if
Would you
that's
get
good,
wrong?
no, because I got diagnosed with hemozygos, which is a blood disorder, they just have to check my iron. They have to check my iron levels in my blood, make sure they're not elevated or dangerous.
It's funny you should mention that. So I went to the doctor 2 weeks ago and they did blood work, and then they wanted to check it again the following week. So my numbers were all out of whack the first time. And then the second time everything had normalized, but my iron levels were really, really low to
Mm.
the point of being anemic.
Mm.
So anyway, I went to the chiropractor and he gave me a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to take an iron supplement, and then I'm going to take I've been researching all these different like ways to boost your iron, and there's like beet smoothies and things like that. And so I'm gonna kind of go down that rabbit hole. And he said, I bet you if you do all that stuff for 60 days, and get blood work done again, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
So, but the one thing I've noticed is how I don't have a lot of like side effects of low iron, but like I am very fatigued. I could get tired real easily.
Yeah. And
And
that's
so
usually, yeah, that's the
it
case for
sucks.
low iron.
It sucks that we're getting old.
Well, well, the funny thing is like when I got diagnosed with my disorder, it was, I had three different opinions from three different doctors. And the last doctor just said, well, do what's best for you, which I'm like, I'm not a doctor, but okay. Like, so, they check everything, make sure how my iron levels look. And again, we still don't know. We still don't know if I have the disease or not. So that's why we're kind of every year I get checked in, and if they say my iron levels look normal, then good. If not, then I go see a hematologist to kind of go see what we're going to do, which usually is always donating blood or do some bloodletting to kind of get my iron levels down. But
Well, that's the thing. Like they were like, I went to my doctor, they drew blood again, and they were like, yeah, everything normalized except for your iron levels, and you may want to follow up with like a hematologist. And I'm like, I don't, I hate this is going to be a rant, but I just don't like having to go to 50 different doctors.
Hmm.
When we were kids, you had a primary care doctor, unless you needed to see a specialist, for some, crazy, I don't know, disease or something like that. You, you didn't have to go to all these different doctors. So, you know, like I said, my chiropractor is very holistic, and if it's not holistic, he has, remedies for things. So it's fascinating. I don't know if I could take another supplement because I'm take calcium, I take vitamin C, I take vitamin K and B12 and B6, and magnesium and fish oil, and it's just
Yeah.
so crazy that like 5, 10 years ago I wasn't taking any of this stuff, and now I got a cabinet full of it.
Yeah. I hear you.
So anyway,
Oh, anyway, so speaking of getting older, on Easter Monday, the day after Easter, news broke that Pope Francis has passed away at the age of 88 years old. So today we're going to just kind of talk a little bit about the Pope, specifically that this is like probably the first Pope within a lot of people's lifetimes that actually didn't replace a pope because they passed away, but replaced the pope because they resigned. Back in like
because Ratzinger
2000,
was the one before him.
no, 2015, it was Pope Benedict, and then Pope Benedict resigned, and then we had Pope Francis kind of take over. So that was interesting. I know my wife's family, who are predominantly Catholic, at least her aunts and uncles, they were kind of shocked, like, oh, I thought if you're a pope, you're a pope for life. What's this whole resigning thing? Like, they didn't realize that that was something that you could do.
Hmm. Do we know why?
So apparently, the official word is that Pope Benedict was resigned due to poor health in 2013, and it wasn't until 2015 when Pope Francis actually took over as the Pope. However, um, other people say part of that poor health might have been due to stress, because that was right when you were seeing so much news coming out of the Catholic Church on abuse and molestation, and there's just a huge expose that kind of came out. And then probably about a
Sexual
couple
misconduct.
years, yeah, and then especially probably like about 3 years after Pope Francis became the Pope, that's when the SBC had their big bombshell broke by a newspaper in um, Texas, where there's all this abuse and child and cover-ups and everything else that was happening in the SBC. So I think that was kind of a big thing, because you're a pope and you're trying to deal with stuff. And Yeah, and I think that just kind of wore on him, along as getting older and having to deal with all your physical health things. I think the stress kind of made it worse. So he decided to resign. And that's kind of at least the summary of why uh, Pope Benedict resigned.
Well, his name was Ratzinger. I was right about that. But
Yes.
Joseph Ratzinger was his name.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember it being a big deal because he was a German native.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess the first pope that I remember, as a kid was John Paul,
Yeah. John Paul II. Yeah.
and he was pope from October of 1978 to April 2005. So he literally was pope my entire life
Yeah.
up until that point, and he died a month before I graduated high school. But apparently, he was really loved.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, but again, I don't really know much about the other two, Francis or Benedict, other than what you said in respect to the scandals in the Catholic Church and him resigning and XYZ. Uh, I don't know where you want to go with this conversation, but it's just, I think it's fascinating. Like you said, he was 88 years old
88 years old. Yeah. And
and he just passed away, I guess, what, this morning
this
or
morning. Yep. As of
which is
recording, which is Monday,
which is
the
wild
21st.
because Vice President D. Vance actually went to visit with him yesterday, and he shook his hand and he blessed him, and he was like, "I pray for you always," and you know, here today, gone tomorrow, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't
Uh,
like.
well,
What are your
it's
thoughts
inter
on?
the I think the position of the Pope is always interesting from a Protestant perspective because, for us, we don't really have a individual or a person that has as much power or at least a positional power as the Pope. I mean, if you think about being the
Mhm.
president of a denomination or being a pastor or
General
even being a
director?
general director, even being like a televangelist, you still wouldn't be able to trump the power that the papacy has for not only just Roman Catholics or just the Catholics in general, but for the whole world. They're kind of really seen as somebody who is kind of like that figurehead of religious life within our world. Um, and even though a lot of Protestants will say, well, the Pope's decisions don't shape our policy or how we practice our faith, uh, I mean, if you start going down the years of from the very first Pope to now, like there's a lot of times where we do see a lot of intersection of how the Pope has influenced pastors, Christian writers, Christian theologians, both from Catholic and Protestant. That kind of shapes our way of life. It's so I always think that the position of a pope is always fascinating because they have such a power to doing everything, and a lot of times whatever they say, whether everyone agrees or disagrees with what the pope says, like it still becomes very influential within the world.
Yeah. Do you I mean, it's been a while since I took took my church history courses in seminary and have been in Bible college, but do you know how it breaks down in respect to the Catholic Church in respect to like the Pope and the cardinals and the that whole thing?
I do not. Hold on. I can.
I was watching the news this morning and I was kind of like, they announced his passing and then there was a group of cardinals, cardinal bishops that
Yeah.
um
So the way it works is you have your pope, your cardinals, your archbishops, your bishops, your priests, and your deacons.
okay.
Now, if you're going to ask
So
me
a
like
group
what
of the
each of those, if you're going to ask me what each of those do, like I don't know.
no. The way that I understood it this morning was that what was the one underneath the Pope? The cardinals?
Yeah, the cardinals. Yeah.
So the Cardinals, there's a group of like I think I want to say 14, um, and they will um, this morning as soon as Pope Francis passed away, and that became knowledge. Um, they went into Saint what is it, Saint Peter's I don't know how to say it, Basilica.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, anyway, so they lock themselves in a room until they figure out who the next pope's going to be.
Yeah, they lock themselves in a room, and then when they know they made a decision, they usually have some smoke coming out of. There's like a chimney, and if you see smoke coming out of the chimney, that usually means that they have decided on the next pope.
Yes.
And what's nice about that is they usually it's not always like, well, it has to be someone that lives in Europe, or it has to be somebody that is part that's living within the Vatican. Like I know Pope Benedict was German, but Pope Francis was was from Argentina. So the
Mhm.
fact that and who knows, the next pope could be an American, the next pope could be a Russian, it could be an Australian or a New Zealand, depending on how how they do all that. So again, like I'm not familiar with my stuff, but that's kind of a that's something I think is kind of a interesting just interesting to see
Do
how they
you
do
know
things differently.
do you know much about Pope Francis and his life and legacy and where he stood on things?
Yeah, I do know that Pope Francis was, again, he was being in Argentina, and look at if you look at some of the kind of the culture within South America, there's a lot of there's a lot of things that he does that may be controversial to, maybe you're like older or more conservative Catholics. So like for an example, like there's a like so Holy Thursday, and I might have mentioned this when we talked about on Easter, about how the Pope, usually in the Catholic Church, they'll always like wash the feet of somebody who is a commoner. Maybe someone, if they find someone like a homeless person on the street, maybe they'll pick that person up so the Pope will go and wash their feet. The first Holy Thursday, when Pope Francis was in power, he wanted to kiss the feet of, and it's usually 12 people because in 12 disciples, because everything has to make sense with the Bible for the Roman Catholics. But he actually did a foot washing sign where he kissed the feet and washed the feet of 10 male and 2 female juveniles that were in prison. And that was very
Mm.
controversial. Um, and actually, what made it even more controversial is one of the men and one of the females were Muslim. So here's the Pope washing the feet of Muslims or people who practice Islam. So that was kind of a big thing. He was very much into world peace, and especially when it came to LGBTQ IAs. He was very much a champion for that community. Um, he was very much against injustice, and a lot of times he kind of was very big on making sure that and that was the thing, he focused too much on trying to end social and economic injustice instead of trying to get abortion ban. Like for him, he sees injustice as like the big thing, where a lot of times, especially for Catholics, like sanctity of life is very huge for the Catholic Church. Like abortion is never on the table for a Catholic. But instead of the Pope being strong about trying to preach a message on anti-abortion, he was more about ending, the social injustice, economic injustice in the world, and that was kind of like his big push, which is kind of controversial um, for some people. For other people, they say, "Hey, that's great." So yeah, um, trying to think if there is anything else. I
No,
mean,
I
he
just think
was
it's fascinating. The Catholic Church in general is like a truly fascinating phenomenon, and you know, uh, people that are practicing Catholics, it's this whole different thing. You were speaking before we started recording about liturgy and the Methodist Church. You know, I think to take it a step further, the Catholic Church is way, way beyond. They do stuff in Latin, and the majority of their services are liturgy. And so um, I can't help but think of was it your wife's grandma that talked about the wine tasting like piss?
yes,
Okay. I told my wife that last week and she died. Um, but anyway, I just have always been fascinated by the Catholic Church. Have really just kind of watched from a distance. I when I was in high school, I played in a rock and roll band, and one of the guys in our group was Catholic, and so we would go play at his church for Saturday night mass, and it was different than any other kind of worship experience that I ever had. Like all of the worship team and everything was in the back of the church. And, we played very traditional hymns, you know, stuff I'd never even heard of before. So, and then you got the Apocrypha, the extended version of the Bible where they have extra books. Uh, and then they have, you have the whole conversation of the afterlife and purgatory and things like that. It's it's truly a fascinating conversation, and I would say that I don't know what the percentage of the people in the United States claim to be Catholic, or even in the world for that matter, but like it's a pretty big phenomenon if you think about it, in respect to the size of that church. Um, and like to what you said earlier, there's not a denomination or church out there that has that kind of pool as far as their leadership is concerned. Um, they know where the leadership starts and finishes, and it's with the Pope. And I do find it kind of interesting though too that it's like people put a lot of stock in meeting the Pope and being blessed by the Pope and things like that. And it's like, well, you still believe that Jesus came to this earth and died for you, um, so that you could have salvation with him. But um, people kind of get wrapped up in the whole Pope being the mortal, not mortal, what's being the physical presence of the church, at
Mm-hmm.
least in the Catholic Church. So, um, don't know if I'm making much sense, but it's.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so like kind of the whole role of a pope within the Catholic Church is a lot of times when the pope says something, usually typically everyone else begins to follow suit. So if the pope, especially within Roman Catholic Church, so if the pope says, "Hey, we need to focus on more social justice issues and we need to spend less time picketing outside abortion clinics," then a lot of times uh, Catholics will kind of follow suit. Even just kind of just reading through kind of all the stuff that he had to deal with, especially within the you know, especially like with the role of women. Like he was very much against the ordination of women as priests, but he was for women kind of serving in other parts of the diocese, because in some cases women were kind of already doing some of these things unofficially within the church, like being kind of a deaconess, um, but they weren't necessarily made official. So he kind of made sure that, hey, why don't we go ahead and make sure that these women and kind of have these ideas that they can kind of do these ministry things. And actually I believe back in April of 2023, Francis announced that 35 women would be allowed to vote at the 16th Ordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops, making it the first time women are allowed to vote in any Catholic Synod of Bishops. So I don't know what that means, but there's been some changes with women. He made apologies to just kind of the way the Catholic Church in history had treated indigenous people. Um, he also was very much in letting the bishops know about when it comes to the LGBTQ, that there is, he kind of denounced the criminalization of homosexuality and basically called on the Catholic Church to distinguish what is a sin and what is a crime, and kind of make those distinctions, because people in the LGBTQ community were getting hurt, and he's saying, hey, this is not okay. You have to figure out what's a sin and what's a crime, and you can't criminalize people who are gay or lesbian. So, and again, people either agreed or disagreed, but for the most part, like, you know, especially within Catholic churches, because there is just one Catholic, like big C Catholic church, it's not like you could say, okay, I'm going to go to this other Catholic church, which believe differently. Like everybody's kind of on the same page.
Mhm.
So if there is any big policies that are made that the cardinals and the Pope make that get passed down to the bishops and the archbishops and the priests, that everyone kind of follows suits. And I mean, the only way if a Catholic is really strong against that, then they can go Protestant. But you can't just go like do a different form of Catholicism because it's just not you're just not able to.
Um, do you think that the women thing is because um when men join the priesthood, they take an oath of celibacy, they don't get married, things like that? Do you think that that's why they take the approach that they do against women?
I
It's because they
think
don't have
so.
those relationships.
I think so. But at the same time, uh, what's interesting is I've known some pastors, or at least read about some pastors who were married, had kids, and then they felt called to ministry and they end up becoming a priest in the Catholic Church. But because they were married before they got their call to priesthood, it was allowed for them to be married because they were married before they took their vows to become a priest. So, I mean, if they're allowing that, I wouldn't be surprised if they eventually do allow marriage. But, I think that's something because, again, and what's fascinating is if you ever read like documentations for any documentations for the Catholic Church, like everything that they decide they're going to do, they always have a scripture reference. Like they don't just say, "Oh, we're going to do it because we think you're a good idea." They usually will lay out some scriptures from Old Testament all the way through the Apocrypha into the New Testament to kind of shape their policy, which I find very fascinating when I read a couple of Vatican II documents. Like it was just interesting how much scripture was being used to kind of help shape their policy or some of their changes that they needed to make.
Yeah. I mean, it's heard some wild stories about the Vatican and like what's under it. And, you know, you're not allowed down there and it's not open to the public. And it's, I've heard things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, um, really getting into the weeds here. But yeah, I don't know. It's the Catholic Church has always been a mystery to me and not in a bad way.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about I don't even know how long we've been recording for. What do you think? What do you think? I was thinking like I was wrap it up, and I'm like, but I don't know how long we've been recording. Anyway, do you? What do you think about when they appoint a new pope, and them actually hiring or appointing somebody that's younger? Because it seems like over the last, I don't know, since in our lifetimes at least, the majority of the popes, I think, with the exception of John Paul II, who, I don't know how old he was when he took the oath of pope. I think he was maybe in his 50s because he died in his 80s because he was pope for like 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Ratzinger was pretty old, and Pope Francis, who just passed, was 88. And so it's like, I wonder, you know, what if they hired? It's so weird, right? We're going to hire Scott to be our next pope. No, that's not how it
Yeah.
works.
I
But
think, yeah, in regards to who they pick for the new pope, I think that's very fascinating because I think a lot of times when they are picking somebody, it usually is determined based on where they feel like the church is headed. What are some of the kind of the general fears that the church has? Which is, when you think about kind of Pope John Paul II, he kind of, you know, I would say during his time, he would probably maybe seem a little bit more moderate, maybe slightly leaning to progressive within his theology, where Pope Benedict was someone who was very conservative with his faith and practice. And then
I would say
obviously
John Paul is the same way.
Yeah. And but then Pope but then of course, Pope Francis was the opposite. He was very progressive with how he tackled things. So I think a lot of it goes on to what's going to be best for the Catholic Church now and in the future. And I think a lot of times, you get into a situation where, depending on who's doing, sometimes it's just like with any other denomination. Sometimes you're gonna you'll have people who are on that team during that time who may want to bring in their people and their buddies. So then it's going to be another aging pope that's probably going to last us for maybe 10 years if we're lucky, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little less, versus having someone who's young who's going to be, the Pope for maybe 20 plus years. Because again, part of the position, or at least the illusion of the position, is that, if you are the Pope, you are, you're kind of considered someone who is anointed by God, by Jesus. So then you serve as the Pope until you are no longer able to. So, and I think with that, they have to make sure, is this person right? Do they fit? Is it someone who represents someone within the world? But then not only that, I think now, especially with all the scandals and stuff that have been pretty prominent within the Catholic Church, you almost need to try to find somebody who doesn't have any baggage. So, if there's no records of them like attacking kids or doing anything shady, embezzling money, or whatever the case may be, like that might kind of take all, because the moment you put someone up there saying this is going to be our new pope, immediately news outlets are going to try to find anything about this guy, to know more about this guy. Where did he come from? Where did he serve? And is there any is there any messed up stuff in their history? Because if there is, then that's going to be the first thing that's going to be exposed, and it's going to kind of curtail what the Pope's trying to do, whether it's like, being kind of the minister of the world in some cases, but also, what policy or changes are they going to try to make within the Catholic Church? Or are they going to try rolling back the stuff that Pope Francis put into place? Are they going to kind of maybe think Pope Francis didn't go far enough with this thing and push it a little bit further? Like, you never know.
Yeah, I mean it's I mean it's not much different than what we've seen in the United States with the presidency over the last, 20 years. Presidential, or I'm sorry, executive orders signed one way, and then the next time a president gets in, they just reverse everything, and then the pendulum swings again, and then they change what they changed, and it's just this big vicious cycle. But anyway, um, have there's never been an African American pope, has there? Or a black pope?
Not that I know of. I don't think there's ever been an African American pope, or a pope of a different color. I mean, we've had popes from Argentina, we've had popes, but most of them, I think, at least in my lifetime, they've all been
European.
European, or they've been, Caucasian, as far as predominantly looking Caucasian. Um,
I mean, that would certainly be different.
mhm.
Although you have more African American and black pastors more in the Protestant side of things, I think. I don't.
So I'm going to correct myself. I just did a quick search. There has been 3 black popes in the Catholic Church
I had no
historically.
idea.
Pope Victor the First from 108-9 to 199 AD. Pope Matildas 311 to 314, and Pope Gelasius the First, who was Pope from 492 to 496. So all before 1,000 years AD, we've had 3 black popes. Ain't that crazy? I never knew that.
I didn't either.
That blows my mind. Like, wow. That's pretty cool. I can't. I mean, oh, wow. That's crazy. And of course, Pope Francis was the first Latin American pope. So
There you
we've had
go.
3 black popes before we've had a Latin American pope. So that's very interesting too. Wow.
Any
Crazy.
other thoughts on Pope Francis or the Catholic Church or where you see him?
It's, the one thing I wish, because I know when Pope John Paul II died, I was in college, and you said you were like in high school, but I
No,
remember being home from, like, I took classes being home and watching the funeral, and it was just really cool to
mm,
just see the cardinals singing in Latin as they were walking with the Pope, taking them to St. Peter's of Basilia. All that stuff was really cool. So I hope, now that this will be the second Pope that has passed away in my lifetime, um, that they
no,
would kind of do
third.
the same thing, or at least heard of.
No,
That they
third because Ratzinger passed away too.
True, but I don't remember there being such a big ceremony for his.
Oh yeah,
Like, I'm
because he
sure
was
there
kind of
was. Well, plus it was kind of like towards the end of COVID. So yeah, he died. I think there was, but nothing like John Paul II. Like, man, when they had that, it felt like the world
weeks.
stopped, and every Catholic from all over the world flew to the Vatican to be at that ceremony.
Are you gonna
Um,
go?
no, I'm not going to go. Um, I have too much stuff to do, but it's pretty cool. I mean, so I hope they do something like that. That's kind of my thing. And then just kind of really, so people can experience, kind of the importance of the Pope in our world. And, I hope that, the next Pope is somebody who, we live in a very different culture than Pope Francis first was elected in Pope and back in 2015. So we definitely need somebody who's going to, be able
Be
to
aware of what they're
navigate,
getting into.
be away what they're getting into, be able to navigate all this stuff that's happening, because there's just so much. But yeah, but I think that's going to do it for me.
You're like, that's it.
That's it. I mean, it is. I'm tired. I have nothing more to say about the Pope. But friends, let us know what are your thoughts about the Pope, whether the Pope in general or about Pope Francis. We would love to hear your thoughts. Did you know that we had 3 African American popes in the history of the papacy? Like, I didn't know that, so that blew my mind. But again, like, leave us your comments. We love to read them, and we love to mention them on air. So, friends, thank you so much for listening. We hope we'll be back on with another episode soon. Talk to you later. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. The Scott Stedman Podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.